Hello, everyone. You have reached We Rise Fighting. We are a labor podcast, and tonight we are going to be talking about something that is likely on the minds of just about everybody on the planet: war and labor. What is the relationship between us? And as we all know, there's a big war going on in Ukraine right now, and it has incredibly important international aspects. It is a war that organized labor, in one way or another, is weighing in on, and there are different commentators saying different things about the war. But tonight we want to talk about what war is and what this war may likely mean for workers, for us, we people that work for a wage. We teach, clean houses, we make beds, we treat people in the hospital, we paint, we build apartment buildings, just workers. This war and all wars mean a lot to us. And so we want to talk about that tonight. And we're going to start by handing it off to Rick, who's going to introduce himself. And perhaps first we'll hand it off to Brian, who's going to introduce himself with this week's bulletins. Brian.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Pfeiffer. I'm a labor and community activist, also photographer and journalist for labor and community issues, including labor and war, unions, and a variety of other related issues. It's good to see everybody, and I hope you're doing well.
Likewise. What's up, everyone? This is Rick Urrutia. I'm here in Denver. I'm a musician, labor activist. I've had all types of union staff jobs, been a union member multiple times, and I'm really excited about this episode here.
And I'm Jerry Scapatullo. I'm an organizer with Pride at Work, with which I've been affiliated since the 80s. I'm a retired member of District 65, Distributive Workers of America, and Local 1557, Nashville Kroger's. And so I'm delighted now to turn it over to Rick, who's going to get us started on tonight's topic. Rick, it's all yours, brother.
All right, man. So just like every episode so far, part of the fun in this is talking about the news and updates, of which we have a few. So as an update we have Starbucks. Jerry, Brian, can you all update us on what's going on in the struggle, where that's at, who has organized, what's going on, guys?
Well, Jerry's more involved with this than I am in the Boston area, but as of, I think, a couple days ago, the 100 stores have now had a union vote at Starbucks, and it's all across the country: Seattle, Chicago, across the South, the Midwest. It's really a nationwide phenomenon. It's fantastic to see. It's well over 80% plus are wins at these stores. These courageous and brave workers are getting a lot of solidarity from a lot of other union folks as well. Some of the tactics include union members and community members in support of the Starbucks workers going into stores to support them and help them in their campaigns, that rallies, petitions, and it's really quite something. So Jerry's much more involved in that than I am in the general Boston area, but we're excited to see it, and we're supporting it in every way we possibly can by promoting it on our blogs and our Facebook pages and our friends, and doing everything we can to assist and support the Starbucks workers, and we encourage our listeners to do that as well. So, Jerry?
Okay, I don't have too much to add, except that I think something like 5 stores are being organized, that is to say, are winning an election every day. And these elections usually are very lopsided. In Boston, the last one was 19-0. And the South, stores in the South, the Right to Work, Jim Crow South, are beginning to organize. I think in San Antonio, where you are, Brian, in Tennessee, and lately in Birmingham, Alabama. Not too far from that Bessemer plant where the Amazon struggle and vote, which I think might be still tied up in the counting of the second vote, is going on. So once you start going into the Jim Crow South with Starbucks, the stakes become higher and more hopeful for labor. But I think there may be some other events going on in labor, Brian.
You know,
Yeah.
No?
if I may just chime in right for a second, because it is exciting news, you know, all the Starbucks stuff. Also, Columbia, South Carolina, Labor Notes released an article recently talking about how workers there walked out because management fired a supervisor that, you know, they decided not to union bust. That supervisor decided not to union bust, so they were fired. And that's what triggered the workers to walk off. And this is Columbia, South Carolina, man. So yeah, this is inspiring stuff that's happening with Starbucks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the Memphis, speaking of the South, the Memphis seven workers, African American workers and others that have been fired in Memphis at a Starbucks store there trying to unionize, but they're fighting back as well. They have a Facebook page and need a lot of support. And there's, I believe, there are various different activities to support them. And Roanoke, Virginia, and all across the South, including, as you mentioned, Rick, South Carolina and other locations. It's fantastic. The South needs to be organized. And in tandem with that, in Madison, Wisconsin, the last few weeks, there's been a whole variety of activities. A local of the sheet metal, air, rail, and transportation workers, local 565, went on strike a couple weeks ago and actually won their strike. They voted for a contract last week, and they are going back to work this week. It was a great victory there. And more information on that is available at the South Central Federation of Labor. Also in Madison, the Madison Teachers Union, which also includes educational assistants, those who help teachers in classrooms with a variety of activities who are extremely low paid. The union local there, the Teachers Union, which is about 3,000 members in Madison, had a rally on May 27th to demand $5 or more for those workers, some of whom make as low as $24,000 a year, when apartments and other costs of living in that city continue to skyrocket. And they had a great rally of hundreds of people, and they're continuing their campaign. And then in tandem with that, at the CUNA insurance group in Madison, which has about 500 workers, the Office and Professional Employees Union is organizing a contract campaign, and they had a rally there, and they're continuing to move forward. And the South Central Federation of Labor has a whole variety of information on their Facebook page and how you can support those workers. And also, there's a strike going on in Racine, Wisconsin, which is south of Milwaukee and about an hour north of Chicago, right on Lake Michigan. They are UAW Local 180 is on strike with their sister local in Burlington, Iowa. In Racine, there's about 700 workers, and they're beginning their 5th week on strike. It's getting pretty heavy once you start getting the 3, 4, or 5 weeks on strike. The insurance was cut off by the company, so the UAW has taken that over, and the Milwaukee Labor Council is going to have a food drive on June 2nd and 3rd. But these workers are holding strong. There's a lot of community support on the picket line, but they really do need as much support as possible. So you can go to UAW Local 180 Facebook page, and you can make support contributions. They're asking for gift cards instead of cash to really help get groceries for the workers. And they do have a union hall in Racine where items can be dropped off. And the picket lines are running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at the CNH, which used to be the Case Company. They make tractors and other farm implements. And they've been on strike now for 4 weeks. They're going on their 5th week, and they could use as much support as possible. And it's really something. So that's all going on in Wisconsin. And then lastly, the Amazon workers are on the move. They lost an election in Staten Island, but there's also a campaign being looked at for violations by Amazon against the workers in Bessemer, Alabama. And those campaigns continue to move forward, and other workers across the country who have been inspired by the Amazon workers who successfully voted for their union in Staten Island are organizing and contacting them around the country. So there is a lot going on, and these are just a few of the struggles that are happening. And the Labor Notes Conference is coming up in Chicago in mid-June, and many of these workers will be there, and these activities and strikes will be supported there, and you can find out more information on a lot of the Facebook pages we mentioned. So workers are on the move, and let's support them and keep moving forward with some solidarity.
Yes.
Thanks.
And just to add one thing to the Amazon struggle, and also labor notes. It is said that 4,000 people have registered for the labor notes conference. And I know that Starbucks workers are going to be all over the place there. And regarding Amazon, the Greater Boston Labor Council is hosting a delegates meeting in about a week, which will be held at Local 25 of the Teamsters, which was the local out of which the new international president, Sean O'Brien, was elected. And the topic is going to be supporting Amazon and Starbucks. So we may hear something now about the much anticipated role that Teamsters may be making in terms of organizing Amazon. We know that O'Brien has met with the lead organizer of the Amazon struggle in New York, whose name escapes me for the moment, and has been pledged all the support that Teamsters can give them. So, wow, there's a lot happening out there, is there not, Rick?
Yeah, that is a lot, man. It's a lot of exciting stuff happening. So for those of y'all who follow our podcast, our last podcast was basically a walkthrough of the arsenal of labor. What kind of weapons labor has at its disposal. Things like strikes, boycotts, rolling strikes, wildcat strikes, all that sort of talk, right? Like direct action. What kind of direct action can labor take? And that episode was actually a bit of a springboard for today's episode, which treats the issue of labor and war. And so in preparation for today's episode, we dug in a little bit, did some research, each of us on our own. Personally, I went kind of deep in researching different labor actions that have been carried out to disrupt war. So that was the focus of my little portion of the show today. And, we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about labor and politics in a larger scale as well. But in preparing for today, man, I got to tell you, comrades, and I got to tell you, anyone who's listening, it was a very inspiring task getting ready for today's podcast. There's just a lot of creative and effective actions that workers have taken to throw a wrench in the war machine. So for instance, comrades, you and I have talked about it in preparation for this podcast. One of those examples that happened most recently was the Greek railway workers that blocked the delivery of U.S. tanks to the Ukraine. That one was particularly exciting. And what happened there is that, yes, these Greek railroad workers were able to block the shipment of those tanks to the Ukraine for 2 weeks. And unfortunately, by the end of 2 weeks, the management hired some scabs and they started moving the weapons again. But the final action of the striking workers was to douse the tanks with red paint, which I think is still a noble act, man. I think that's still an act worth doing and worth mentioning because, man, that's how those tanks are rolling in, is covered in red paint when they need to be camouflaged, But what could have sustained this? What could have sustained this struggle? That's some of the stuff that we talked about in our last episode. When we talked about, for instance, the general strike in Seattle and how much work goes into being in solidarity with striking workers and how effective it can be in the end. So that's, part of why we're tossing some of these ideas out today. In reading about these Greek railway workers out, decided not to transport those tanks. I also learned about workers in Pisa, Italy, who refused to deliver weapons, ammunitions, and explosives to the Ukraine. And in Belarus too, railroad workers have refused to deliver urgently needed supplies for the Russian army. So, there's all types of stuff happening. And another big chunk of where some of my research took me was the ILWU, the Longshore Workers Union on the West Coast, perhaps most notably Local 10. And, they're particularly, this was a pretty interesting case, comrades, as y'all already know, and as we've discussed. This was a particularly interesting case because Local 10 and the ILWU historically have carried out some pretty inspiring, some pretty militant actions against the war in Iraq, against apartheid in South Africa, for the release of Black Panther journalist Mumia Abu-Jamal. They've done some pretty legit things. And right now, they're refusing to handle cargo, or that's right, they're refusing to handle cargo that's going to Russia, in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. And, whereas that gets us to the meat of the matter as far as what labor can do to disrupt the war machine, it also begs other questions, because in this case, comrades, and in this case, I just wish it was in solidarity with the working class of Ukraine, with the people of Ukraine. That's I think labor can just be stronger when we unite through international solidarity, and not wave the flags that our ruling class wants us to wave. That's essentially what I'm trying to say.
I think that, when you talk about the international aspects of worker solidarity, Rick, it's not this abstract thing that we could read about in a book. It's like for real. And I think one chapter of that book is Starbucks. Starbucks is an international company. It has stores in Chile, Brazil, Australia, probably a dozen stores, a dozen countries around the planet. And here, you could look at the war in Ukraine from the point of view of Starbucks, because Starbucks workers are on a global continuum. There are Starbucks workers, of course, the United States and many other countries, and but Starbucks as a company, it begins with the picking of coffee beans in places like Ethiopia, where Ethiopian children, oppressed child laborers, for pennies a day, will pick coffee beans. Picking coffee beans for Howard Kurtz, either directly for Starbucks or for one of their, global subcontractors, and that uncompensated wealth of that child labor in Ethiopia is what builds all the power and the wealth and the stolen wealth of Starbucks, which is nevertheless, the workers in Starbucks in this country are just fighting back with a vengeance and organizing like 5 stores a day. And like Brian says, they have 100 stores right now that they're in contract negotiations with. So, but imagine what it would be like if this new Starbucks Workers United National Union of Starbucks Workers, could relate, and I think will ultimately relate, to Ethiopian children who are picking the same coffee beans to go into the coffee that they sell you over the counter, and show some solidarity with them. And because Starbucks is an international company, and the workers are international workers that work for Starbucks globally. And it's not ironic, I think, that the one country in the United Nations that voted not to support the Ukrainian war as conceptualized by the U.S. State Department was Ethiopia. Even though there are dozens and dozens of countries in the United Nations that abstained from the vote, withdrawing and withholding support for the war, which is an unpopular war, probably with the majority of workers on the planet, especially workers in the global south in places like Sri Lanka, which the price of oil is actually, which has been raised because of sanctions, is actually destroying that country and harming a lot of other countries. So there is a definite connection between international worker solidarity and war. And, we don't have to go back into the history of World War I and World War II or Vietnam or Korea to pull out examples of this. We have it right in front of us today. So I think that there are many other aspects of this question that we want to touch upon tonight. And with that, I'm going to yield a little bit here.
But you know what? No, thank you. You're absolutely right. These issues aren't abstract. Again, in preparation for today's podcast, I came across this article about these Scottish train drivers who refused to move a freight train carrying ammunition that was believed to be destined for British forces in the Gulf. And this is in 2003. Now, there were several articles about these train drivers refusing to move that ammunition. And I think it's worth noting, and this gets to things not being abstract, I think it's particularly worth noting that it was only two of them, and you'll find articles about that one action that these two workers took. It was only two of them, which is part of what I want our podcast to communicate. It doesn't always have to be everyone, man. It doesn't have to be a general strike every time. And I'm not talking anyone out of a general strike, right? But two workers that are key or instrumental to the transportation or production of war, for them to go on strike or for them to refuse to do their job, for them to refuse to be complicit in the war machine, that's significant. And then for the action of these two workers, again, just emphasize that two, and for the actions of these two workers to get that much media coverage and attention, I think speaks to the power of the working class and exactly the international solidarity that I think you're speaking of, Jerry.
Yeah, thanks, brothers. This goes to the heart, I think, of why we started We Rise Fighting this podcast, is to raise these questions. And one of them is that, I think it's a collective view that we are in a global class war. And that the question is, which side of the barricades am I on as a worker in the United States in particular, since that's where we're from? And we're raising these questions because these questions need to be discussed and reconciled and debated and talked about inside of labor unions as well as workers generally in this country. And we know that the same companies, the same corporations, and the same banks who are preventing women in this country from having baby formula, who are responsible for speculation and gentrification, and who are driving up inflation, are many of the same companies and corporations that want to neo-colonize again Russia, and in particular Ukraine. 30% of the wheat production, and at this time it's non-GMO, is coming from Ukraine and Russia, and Monsanto and other big wheat companies want that in the Ukraine. And of course, big oil wants to have complete control of that oil, the companies such as ExxonMobil and therefore. And we know here in this country, they're always fighting, right? They're always fighting us on wage increases. They're always trying to reduce our standard of living, take away our safety. They told us to literally drop dead in the pandemic. There's no relief. I mean, we just heard that from this administration in the White House, right? You all can forget all of your COVID protections, but at the same time, we're going to advocate for $56 billion to go to Ukraine. And who does that benefit? So we're raising these questions because they are literally life and death. And are we going to be pitted against our fellow workers around the world, or are we going to fight who are all truly supposed to be fighting, the corporations and the banks who are really destroying the world? And if we look at the environmental aspect, it's absolute destruction. When we look at the U.S. war machine with bases and 800 bases all over the world, and the gas and the fossil fuels that are used for that, these are the folks who we are raising up today to take a look at and investigate and research. And so we're not played, and we're not going in the wrong direction in terms of fighting that global class war that we're raising up on this podcast, and trying to see what kind of discussion we can continue to have. And the Starbucks, lastly, the Starbucks workers is a wonderful example of how the workers are unionizing and asking the question, like supporting the coffee pickers and the transportation workers that are getting the beans and the other supplies to the stores, to the production and the distribution networks and uniting with the workers in solidarity all over the world instead of being pitted against our fellow workers in Ukraine and even in Russia. So we're raising these questions just to have that discussion today, and it's fantastic. So thank you.
Right. And, many people have in their minds the image of construction workers on Wall Street beating up Vietnam War protesters in 1970 at this one event that happened. However, labor in the United States, not the labor bureaucracy, not George Meany, not the AFL-CIO executive, was very much opposed to the Vietnam War. And if you want to read about it, Phil Foner has a 160-page book called Labor in Vietnam, which is online as a PDF that you could read, that gives chapter and verse of the labor councils, local unions, and union presidents that were very much against the war. In the 1970s, when I was a member of District 65, our union, as early as 68 was, actually that was that early, but in 68 was against the Vietnam War, largely as a result of the historic work of Cleveland Robinson, the African-American president of our union, who was one of the founders of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. But it wasn't just, there were many unions. For a year and a half, actually, in the late 60s, the Teamsters under Freddie Fitzsimmons and Walter Reuther, had an organization that was against the war. It wasn't terribly effective, but it did represent something when you have two of the biggest, if not the biggest, international unions in the United States, when their top leadership was against the war. That had an effect on local labor councils and on politicians, on Congress, on the Hatfield-McGovern Amendment to end the war, and all of it. You cannot discount that. And in view of the fact that June and Pride at Work Month is coming up, I want to proudly note that Howard Wallace, the co-founder of Pride at Work, organized dozens of labor councils and labor leaders against the war in 1971 and 72 through the National Peace Action Coalition, which was a mass organization of the Socialist Workers' Party, which, along with the CP's mass organizations and the SDS and other peace groups, were part of the huge anti-war movement in the United States, beginning with Workers' World Party in 1962, rolling all the way through the 70s. So labor in this country has often fought against foreign wars. And, that is something that the legacy of that is not like a known thing. It's like not a thing, but it really is a thing. And we may be seeing more of that as time goes on, because how long, can this war go on? As one diplomat, even a war diplomat, has said that we're willing to fight this war to the last Ukrainian, because it's really the Ukrainians and the Russians that are doing all the dying in this war. But the rest of the world is suffering because of the sanctions. And workers in India, in South America, and Africa, in Sri Lanka, and Oceania, and other parts of the globe, are not for this war. They are not for this war. And sisters and brothers, talk to your Black friends, your Latinx friends, your Indian friends, and ask them, ordinary workers, what they think of this war. And I think you will get an answer that is something that we have to keep on our minds and have faith in, because ordinary workers are the ones that are going to be voting in on this war or not. And so we have our work is cut out for us, but there's a lot going on right now that is not getting transmitted, on CNN and MSNBC and Tucker Carlson and all the rest of that. But if you're in touch with workers in the labor movement, there is movement going on, and it is not gung-ho pro-war, not at the level of workers. It is not like that, in my view.
I certainly hope not. Just in hearing and hearing you speak there a little bit, Jerry, it reminds me the traveling that I've done. Every time I go to another country, you just realize how much we have in common with each other. What may change is the culture. What may change is what we're wearing or exactly what kind of food we are eating. But really, each one of us wakes up, wants a breath of fresh air, wants to see the sun, wants to go, spend time with our family, wants to go to the lake, wants to go to the ocean, whatever the case may be. Wants leisure time, wants to make art, whatever the case may be. And I think it's important to go out there and see this stuff for yourself, because it gives you that sense of global community, and it just helps connect the dots with that international solidarity. I think in preparation again for today's podcast, another important thing that I came across was, again, the ILWU. Thank you for leaving a legacy. But again, the ILWU and its anti-fascist actions, because here we are talking about war, and part of what makes war possible, or part of what gets people here in the U.S. on the wrong side or misguided as to who they support, part of what makes war possible is the nationalism that we're taught, and the fever-like, patriotism that we're taught. And sometimes all our unions teach us, or all our union leadership teaches us, is buy American. And it's not like that. It's not like that. Our struggles are interconnected, as Jerry and Brian have been saying, as far as Starbucks workers, our struggles are interconnected as far as, being part of the production and part of, the path of transportation to get armament to the war machine. There's places where we can throw a wrench in there. So, yeah, I think it's important to just not just contest the war, at home, but also raise class consciousness here at home, because that would change who we end up supporting in moments of conflict between ruling classes that have nothing to do with us.
We're getting back to the Vietnam War again. It was an extremely unpopular war. At first, it wasn't. Or rather, to be put a finer point on it, people went along with it. We are socialized to be pro-war in this country. There's a lot of patriotism, flag waving, talks about the righteous war of World War II, and all of it that predisposes many people to believe our government. But then you have the Pentagon Papers coming out in 1970, and you have the Vietnam Vets Against the War, and then you have the truth about the war and the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which is a fabrication about the attack on the second cruiser in the Gulf of Tonkin that led to the war resolution that passed, I think 99-1 in the U.S. Senate, which opened the door to the racist draft and up to 500,000 U.S. infantry people going to war in Vietnam. And that happened. It wasn't that long ago, in 1965, 1966, that happened. But the war became extremely unpopular once the truth came out. And I think we have to watch out for the truth and the actual misstatements about the war and the falsification of the facts and the gung-ho nature of the war and the ultimate imperialist aims of this war, which is to extend the power of U.S. corporations beginning in Europe and transnationally to penetrate markets in a weakened Russia and ultimately in China, just as the end of the Warsaw Pact and the conversion of countries which had formerly had been in the sphere of orbit of Russia, were transformed to, in the words of one Wall Street broker, areas of $7 an hour workers, which we really need. That was largely what that war was about, and what the capitulation of the Soviet Union under Gorbachev was about. So, but it's all going to come out. But even we don't have to wait for it to come out. I think workers in our bones, is this good? Is this good for me? Is this somehow helping me?
Yeah.
That NATO is going to be stronger and be in a more military position to fight the war. Is this really going to help me? So that's a question that we need to ask ourselves. And the more we ask that question, the more answers will come, and workers will figure stuff out. We always have.
Yeah, it's wild to see, honestly, even in social media, it's wild to see people, suddenly waving the Ukrainian flag and, just with this fervor, man. It's certainly unexpected for me. And, yeah, Jerry, getting back to Vietnam, as y'all know, in preparation for today's podcast, I watched a documentary called Sir No Sir, which I highly recommend to anyone listening to this. It's basically about GI resistance during the Vietnam War. And, my takeaway, or the way I kind of broke it up in my mind at least, was that part of the movie focused on the earlier years of Vietnam, which I was brought to understand was mostly a ground war. And then there was so much GI resistance and opposition to the war at home that Nixon turned it into an air war later on. But nevertheless, the point I'd like to make here, actually, and yet another one of my takeaways from that movie that, again, relates to labor, man, and the power of the working class and just the power of withholding our labor, is that I remember they were talking about one of the espionage GIs, or whatever they may be called, that is listening to conversations from overhead, just flying overhead and listening to conversations below, just spying on the enemy. I just remember that one person, that spy, or whatever that person may be called, that espionage person, at one point disagreed with the war and decided to stop sharing the information that they picked up. And they stopped sharing the information they picked up with the military brass in Vietnam, and they stopped sharing that information with the cabinet, Nixon's cabinet in DC. And you can't do anything when you don't have that information, And again, I guess that just kind of is tying some of this stuff together that we've talked about and that I've been able to read about. Because sometimes, again, we don't have to do an all-out general strike, man. Sometimes, it's key workers and key industries doing key things to shut production down, including in war. I think a light went off in our last conversation in preparation for today's episode, where, we noted that the largest employer in the U.S. is the U.S. military. So yeah, I think we do have to figure out what its weak spots are, what its pressure points are, and how we can support any GIs who are taking action within the belly of the beast.
Yeah, I think that just a couple points related to that, Rick, that the protests were extremely critical against the Vietnam War. But one can make a very strong argument as well that it was the workers, including GIs who are workers, with the lead of the black workers who made the most sacrifices, that were eventually able to shut down the Vietnam War, and the workers that involved the production of war, distribution of the armaments that stopped all the GIs/workers that did not fly certain places all across the world, where things did not get to Vietnam through direct actions of various types. And this is why, to our listeners, why we're raising labor in war and workers in war, because we need the protests. Protests are very, very important. And the government, our capitalist, imperialist government, needs to be confronted. by protest every day and all day. But at the end of the day, to shut down war, we're going to need the workers to stop contributing their labor power to the war machine. And that is what it's going to take. And that's fundamentally, but undergirding that is ideology and a program and finding out like which side of the barricades we are on. We are workers. We like to work. We like to produce. The question is, what are we producing, and what are we producing, and whom are we producing for? We can be using all of that labor power and all of those efforts that we're making to make war armaments to contribute to our communities, to making baby formula, to educating our kids, to building schools, to reconstructing bridges. We could be doing all kinds of things for our society and community and humanity instead of destroying the planet. And the only ones that benefit are the war profiteers and the banks and corporations, the very same ones that have told us to drop dead during the COVID pandemic. And lastly, we don't need to go that far back, but if we look at the last 30 years and NATO's lies and the U.S. lies about whether one agrees with socialism or the Eastern Bloc or not, the statistics and the facts are in front of your face. The standard of living has plummeted in Eastern Europe. Women's standard of living has plummeted. In Poland, under the socialist bloc, women had all kinds of rights regarding reproductive justice. Today, abortion is virtually illegal, and on and on and on. So every time the U.S. and NATO and the war profiteers tell you, as a worker in this country we're speaking to, that they're going somewhere for freedom, we know that's a lie. It's always about profit and plunder and invading to make more profits for big oil and other corporations and bankers. So, and to stop that from happening, we need to be involved in shutting it down in all kinds of different ways and educating our fellow workers on why we need to do these things.
And I think when we're talking about workers, it's important to know, like, young workers today, what's the unemployment rate? Young workers, how tough a time are young workers, say between the ages of 16 and 19 or 16 through 25? Just, what is life like? And, the real unemployment rate in the United States is not the 3.5% that you hear about, on the news. The real unemployment rate is 7%. It's called the U6 unemployment rate by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It counts workers who are only part-time employed, even though they would like to have more hours, but there are not more hours that they can have out there to work. They can't find the jobs they would like to have, but they're not available. That official unemployment rate is 7%. The official unemployment rate for young Black workers is 15%. The unofficial, real unemployment rate for Black workers is roughly double that. It's about 20%. Well, it's not double, but it's 20%. Youth unemployment, the real youth unemployment rate in the United States is 20%, which is approaching depression level rates. Even though it might have been measured differently during the Depression, I don't know. But I do know that the real unemployment rate for youth is 20% in this country. And these youth, they need a job. They need to pay the rent. They need to eat. They need to put gas in their cars if they're lucky enough to have a car. And these are the young workers that for Starbucks and Amazon, because if you work for Amazon, you're probably pretty young to be able to endure the grueling work that they put you through in an Amazon warehouse. These are the workers that are going to lead the way in the future, I think. And it's really important to understand where they're at. There was full employment under slavery, in the country. The unemployment rate was very low. And it was like that for indentured servants also back in the day, in the 19th and 18th century. So we shouldn't be bamboozled by the glowing reports of the low unemployment rate in this country. If you work 1 hour, you are considered in the workforce and employed. you are not considered unemployed in the U1, more or less official unemployment rate that you hear about the first Thursday of every month on the news. If you work 1 hour, you're considered fully employed. But so the material conditions on the ground are what's going to affect where workers go in this country, just as it has always affected where workers go and what we believe and what we fight for and what we struggle for and what we need for ourselves and our comrades and our families. So there's a lot that is happening out there that is not yet as visible as it will be, I think, before too long.
I'm hopeful, man. I left the preparation for this podcast made me really hopeful. Hearing about some of these struggles that took place out there. We've had dock workers, warehouse workers going on strike. In international solidarity against dictators in Chile, against dictators in El Salvador, against our apartheid in South Africa, against the war in Iraq, so I'm hopeful. And each time they do this, it's a big announcement to the rest of the labor movement that, hey, y'all can do this too. Y'all should do this. We don't want to be complicit in this. We don't want to bomb people who are just like ourselves, who just want a little bit of leisure time, a little breath of fresh air, some peace, some art, some science, to devote our lives to something that's positive for our community rather than devote our lives towards producing for the profit of the 1% or the bombings of warmongers. We're not different like that, and it's inspiring to see workers, just everyday workers like us, being able to take these types of actions. So yeah, for me, I'm hopeful, and I'm happy that we did this podcast because it helps spread word of these actions because we need more of them.
What are some of the things you found out in your research, Rick, in terms of labor actions in the war?
As far as this particular war, the only thing I saw was the ILWU stance, saying that they won't send stuff to Russia. But outside of that, man, I can't. The ILW just has such a legacy, man. I feel like it's just been this latest thing. It's like, why not take the side of the Ukrainian working class or just the international working class, rather than whatever our corporate media is telling us to side with, But yeah, no, really, outside of that, I've read about dock workers going on strike. Rather than load British-made arms that were destined to be shipped to Chile after the assassination of Salvador Allende in 1973, which was like Chile's 9/11, and Chile finally, a socialist president comes to power, through the election process, everything is fair and square, man. And, of course, the U.S. isn't having that, and they produced Chile's 9/11 because it was September 11th of 1973 that they took out Salvador Allende. So there were solidarity actions around that. There have been solidarity actions from the ILWU against, some of the stuff that was happening in El Salvador during the 80s. They refused to load military cargo going there. As I mentioned, before, also acts in solidarity with Mumia Abu-Jamal. There have been, Italian unions have refused to load shipments going to Saudi Arabia, so as to throw a wrench in the works of that war machine. In that case, the union workers refused to load two electrical generators that were expected to be used in the war effort. And I mean, listen to that too, not all of it has to be armament. Electricity, that's critical for a war. If you can shut the electricity down, that's helping. So yeah, it's just been all different types of actions that have been taken. some of them massive, some of them involving like, the 10,000 dock workers on the West Coast all going on strike at the same time, or, using their contract in such a way that they don't work on that day, I should say. Everything from that, from the 10,000 ILWU workers to those 2 railway workers I mentioned before. It was just 2 of them, and the reason they were able to carry out their action is because no one else knew how to, drive the rail path that they knew how to drive, So the warmongers aren't going to step in and drive that train, there's power in that. And I think, along with figuring out what the jugular is, along with figuring out where we can throw a wrench in the works as far as the war machine, I think we also need to figure out how we're going to support the workers who take those actions. That's just as critical, because otherwise they can only sustain those actions for so long before scabs get involved, before the police get involved, before the strike is broken with tear gas and batons and rubber bullets, stuff like that. So those were some of my main takeaways from the research, Ryan.
Reminds me of we discussed this previously, but the American Servicemen's Union, of course, it's servicemen's because at that time women were not allowed in the military per military policy in the U.S. But the American Servicemen's Union during the Vietnam War, which had tens of thousands of members all across the world. They had a newsletter called The Bond. They had coffee houses. And of course, again, black workers were in the lead of that. But it was unified, Latino, white workers, other workers that were drafted and helped shut down the Vietnam War. And then that's all described in this book called Turn the Guns Around by John Catalanato, who's a lead organizer for the American Servicemen's Union. And I think that's a great model to take a look at how that could be adopted to today. And also today, the military, to a great extent, has been privatized. For example, there's a lot of, when they move camps from the United States, and some can be moved within 24 hours, a lot of those, there's a lot of private companies that serve food, for example, or uniforms. So there's all kinds of different points and all kinds of different unions that are in these kinds of industries, or workers, of course, generally, but also some of these industries are organized, and that could be potential ways to elevate the struggle as well.
Yeah.
Okay. I think it'd be very appropriate if we went out tonight the same way we came in with some music.
I think
is very apropos to what we're talking about.
I think that's very appropriate. I think that's a great idea, and we'll definitely do that. Also, folks, for anyone listening, I will be sharing the articles that helped inform some of the content that I talked about today. I'll be sharing those articles on our Facebook profile, so please go ahead and like our Facebook profile for We Rise Fighting. And for our next episode, I'm very excited about our next episode. Jerry, you want to speak to that real quick? Because
it is Gay Pride Month coming up, and we're going to talk about the revolutionary roots and the union labor roots of the gay liberation / civil rights movement, say from the mid-30s to the present. So I'm looking forward to that, and we may see some of you listeners at the Labor Notes Conference coming up in a couple of weeks in Chicago. So maybe we'll be posting something about that as well. So anyway, it's been a wonderful evening of discussion here. Thank you, brothers, for that, comrades. So
likewise, thank you, comrades.
Take us home, Rick.
Yeah, thank you, brothers. Thank you, comrades. Thank you, everyone listening. Thank you to the workers who, made this whole conversation possible. Everything from the workers who made our computers to, the workers who made this table that my computer sits on, this roof over my house, all that jazz. Thank you all. And in solidarity, we look forward to seeing you or chatting with you in the next episode. Take care, everyone.
All right. Solidarity.
Bye-bye.
Well, come on, all of you big, strong men. Uncle Sam needs your help again. Got himself in a terrible jam way down yonder in Vietnam. Put down your books and pick up a gun. We're gonna have a whole lot of fun. And it's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Well, there ain't no time to wonder why. Whoopee, we're all gonna die. Now come on, Wall Street, don't be slow. Man, this is war, a go-go. There's plenty good money to be made, supplying the army with the tools of the trade. Just hope and pray that if they drop the bomb, they drop it on the Viet Cong. And it's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Well, ain't no time to wonder why. Whoopee, we're all gonna die. Now come on, generals, let's move fast. Your big chance is here at last. Now you can go out and get those reds, cause the only good commie is one that's dead. And you know that peace can only be won when the blowing all the kingdom comes. Sing it! 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Louder! Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Well, ain't no time to wonder why. We're all gonna die. Listen, people, I don't know how you expect to ever stop the war if you can't sing any better than that. There's about 300,000 of you fuckers out there. I want you to start singing. Come on. And it's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Well, ain't no time to wonder why. We're all gonna die. Now come on, mothers throughout the land. Pack your boys off to Vietnam. Come on, fathers, don't hesitate. And send your sons off before it's too late. Be the first one on your block. Have your boy come home in a box. All right. 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Well, ain't no time to wonder why. We're all gonna die. All right.
Ladies and gentlemen, Country Joe McDonald.